recognize our own creative voice, which is the thing that I've struggled with. Sometimes it can be really hard to think of ourselves outside of the right now. So let's take a moment to look at someone who unfortunately is no longer with us. When I was about 12, I went on an art trip to London, and I became somewhat fascinated with the dark works of Francis Bacon. I saw this triptych up close in a gallery, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. I had no idea that at the time that this was his comeback piece after a long stint of releasing no paintings at all. And if we lay out a somewhat oversimplified timeline of Bacon's creative voice and career, it looks a little bit like this. He and his parents lived between Dublin and London during World War I. He leaves, or you could say he was pushed out of home at 17 as his sexuality wasn't accepted by his father. He travels to Berlin, to Paris and London, attempting to find himself, looking for inspiration. And it's on these travels that he finds the works of Picasso and Poussin, who he's later hugely inspired by. In the late 20s, he sets up in London and has built a successful name for himself as an interior designer, which is quite surprising and something I was not aware of. And then in the early 30s, he meets artist and mentor Royd Maistre and began to concentrate on painting. He said at the time that he had friends who encouraged him. And when you're young, you can always find people who are interested in what you're doing. And I think there's something to be taken from that. We really should surround ourselves with the people who do take an interest in our creative endeavors. His crucifixion piece, which in part was based upon Picasso's Three Dances, was the first time that he received recognition from the art world, but it wasn't a particularly positive response. And then he was rejected by the International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936. So a little bit more rejection. But just the next year, he was featured in the Young British Designers exhibit alongside big names such as Maistre, his mentor, and Graham Sutherland. And then what came next was a bit of a blackout. After the exhibit, he went into blackout mode, if you like, and whatever he painted for the next 6 years, he destroyed. The Second World War arrived, and he served in the Red Cross and the air raid precautions. And then in 1944, he makes a strong comeback with this triptych that affected me so much when I was young. And from here, he fully commits to painting. So what if we take a really, really high level snapshot of just some of the works during this timeline? If we look at the top rows, left to right, we have the rug from his days in interior design, followed by his early works in the 30s in the blackout period. Onto the next row, we see the triptych, his comeback in the 40s, all the way through the 40s to the end of the 40s, where he then concentrates on just the human form. And then we have the 50s and the 60s in the rows at the bottom. His work is now covering 4 decades, and we can visually see slight shifts in his creative voice over that time. And he was now extremely recognized and respected, but he didn't settle. A good friend of his said he never arrived. If he felt he had, he probably would have stopped painting in 1962 or something. And he didn't. Here we can see a snapshot of the works from the 70s top row, 80s middle, and in the early 90s, where he painted right up until his death in May 1992. So if we look at a snapshot of Bacon's work over the 7 decades, yeah, we can recognize it as one creative voice, but also that it changes in flavor throughout the years. And Bacon never settled, he never arrived or felt that he'd made it. He continued to question, to experiment. So how does this relate to us, and how do we recognize our own creative voice? Well, if we're at the start of our career, we need to respect that this is just the very, very first version of us. And if we're later on, we need to spend the time considering where we've been, looking back at where we've been and what we've done. And this is really what I needed to do to respect my own creative voice. This is what I did when I hit a blackout stage myself a few years ago. I felt really lost, and only now with hindsight and reviewing where I've been, have I been able to appreciate my own direction and what matters to me the most. So I've roughed out my own timeline here from finishing my education in 2004 to the present day. You may even want to fully matrix this stuff, spreadsheet it, do it however you want, but Create a column for how happy or fulfilled that you felt during each point in time, what you specialized at that time to get a better understanding of yourself and how other people might have perceived you. Force yourself to see your own uniqueness. That's what I did, and it really did help. So I think the overall lesson for today is that creative voice is a moving target. Keep chasing that target, as we all do, but be comforted in the knowledge that you should never be able to catch up with it. Thank you.